Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I said that it's exactly 5 years since I first came to Denmark, and the first time I came to Copenhagen, but I met the then chief executive of Odense. I still can't pronounce Odense, but anyway. And I was really excited by what he said about leadership and relationships in this city, so it's brilliant to actually come here to the city itself. But I wanted to start this morning by telling you a story about someone called Anne. So Anne is someone probably very familiar to all of you. She lives a life completely defined by her disease. She's in pain, she's unwell, she has heart problems, renal problems, you name it, she's overweight. She can't sleep very well. She can't do really simple things like walk to the bus stop or reach up to wash her hair. And when I met her, she said to me, "I've lost myself." And she has 9 specialist doctors. Here's an image of one of them. And I think in some parts of the world, she would be considered really lucky to have all these doctors, all these specialists around her. They're all highly qualified, and she sees them all for free on a regular basis. But I think that this is part of the problem, because keeping appointments with all these doctors has become basically the full-time job of Anne. And so I invited all the doctors to meet with me and to discuss her case. And I think this is very similar to what Morten was talking about in the last, I don't speak Danish, but from what I could understand. So maybe not, maybe it was something else completely. But anyway, I invite them all to meet together. And what they begin to kind of pick it all apart, and they say, well, normally we can just see one kind of tiny, it's like looking through a letterbox. We see one tiny segment of the patient, and each doctor sees a different segment. And when they all got together, they said something which Anne herself already knows, which is basically all the drugs and all the medication and everything Anne is on doesn't really work. And in fact, what they ended up doing when they all got together was taking all of themselves apart from one out of the picture and leaving Anne with one specialist and one drug, actually. But I think what's important to me is that Anne really represents the biggest challenge faced by health systems in the UK, health systems in Denmark, health systems globally, which is how can we make this shift from systems which are designed to fight infectious disease to today's challenge of living with chronic illness? Because our health systems are this near-perfect model of mass industrial production. You're ill, you're put in a queue, you're lined up, you're put in a bed, and you move along the conveyor belt just like any other industrial process. And it's meant to cure you. And this is a culture of kind of very vertical systems of power. You know, the doctor's at the top, then the nurse, they can do one thing, the administrator another, and power is absolutely concentrated at the top, and the whole thing is trying to kind of move information and knowledge up and down these kind of very, very difficult systems. Of course, this was the natural order of things. When our systems were designed in the, after the Second World War, this was how the world was seen in these very hierarchical ways, and the systems worked when we all suffered from contagious disease. But today, this is the problem, that 70% of the expenditure in our systems goes on people who cannot be cured, who can't actually even be well cared for in industrial systems. And I think this is the big challenge, that these systems just can't cope with the problems of today, let alone the kind of further complexities that come with aging. And also what's very important to me in my work is that I think it's not just the patients who suffer in these systems, it's also the professionals and carers, perhaps many of you feel this way, who are trying to do good work in systems that simply weren't designed to support good professional work today in this century. In Britain, we have 93,000 vacancies in our health system. 1/3 of midwives aren't working. 1 in 10 positions for care are vacant. And the thing is, our politicians, they keep promising us more doctors, more nurses, more carers, but it's like pouring water into a bottomless bucket because the systems don't work and it's too stressful to work in these systems, so people keep on leaving. And the system itself is at breaking point. We need to kind of think again, and we need to think about how we can reinvent. So the challenge, in other words, isn't how can we build more hospitals, how can we make our existing systems more efficient, how can we do administration better. I think it's to completely rethink the model of help on offer. And that Anne, and millions of people like Anne, need help to change the way they live. And I think that I would classify it like this. We need to move these extremely vertical systems on their sides and create new horizontal systems that join us up together in new ways and include different people, our peers, our colleagues, our professionals. So the question really is, because I think we all agree with this in this room, is how do we actually make this happen? So I started out 30 years ago. I'm a social activist. I started out working in Africa and Latin America. I worked in communities where people really suffered from a lot of health problems and poverty was very acute. I worked with a big international charity. I worked with the World Bank. I worked with UNICEF. And I kept watching as time and time again, the kind of rules of the institutions and the politics of the institutions stood in the way of the change that the professionals inside the institutions were trying to make. And I saw the way that ideas that looked brilliant on policy papers and on kind of, organizational documents, they looked brilliant. But when they kind of hit the ground, when they connected with communities, somehow they just didn't seem to work. And so that was the starting point, really, of the process that I still use today, which was to think about how can we step outside the institutions? How can we begin to live the realities of others? Have the mindsets that start with those we're trying to support rather than the mindsets of the institution. And think about people's real knowledge, their ideas, their power, and start from that position. And that means, I think, working in a different way. So that was also the beginning of a design process that I use today. And the methods that I use, which are very open, low cost, and all about human connection. I don't think we can use the tools we used before to design the new approaches. If we want new approaches, we also need new tools. Of course, many, many people say that they work with the community. And what they really mean by that, I think, is that they take the questions that we design within our institutions into the community. So we're sitting in our institutions and we think, we need to change the way we work. We need to fix this service. We need to improve this. So we go to the community and we say to them, how could we fix the service? How could we do our job better? But this is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is taking our expertise and sitting within communities and saying, what does your life look like? How could we support you to live a different life? How could we support you to flourish? And that really is a different question. So when I met Anne, what did I do? I started a small experiment, and in 2 clinics, in 2 quite poor areas of London, close to where I live, I asked the doctors to send me what they call their heart sink patients. Now, I don't know, do you have a translation for heart sink? Heart sink is what doctors say when the patient walks into their clinic or their doctor's surgery and their heart sinks because they think, what am I going to do with this person? They have such complex conditions. And anyway, their problems are really about the fact that they don't work and they're poor and their housing is not very good. I think in Denmark, everybody's housing is good. But in Britain, their housing isn't very good. And so on. So what can I do with this patient? So we said to the doctors, look, anybody who comes into your surgery that you think is a heart sink patient, please, you send them to us. And when people came, we didn't offer any formal program, and 3 things continually jumped out of us, and these will be very familiar to you. So the first is the focus, is that when people come into our systems, what happens is that they become consumed by the condition, and they begin more and more to define themselves and their whole lives by their illness, rather than focusing on that part of themselves, which may be quite small, but that part of themselves that is well. And so we saw the first thing that any future system needs to do is it needs to focus on that part of every person that's well. The second thing is we need to design for complexity, because people increasingly have multiple conditions, and obviously the older we get, the more our conditions are multiple. And yet still we see, I don't know how it is in Denmark, but still we see in Britain that most service and most innovation focuses on the condition. How can we help this person who may have a problem of obesity, who may have diabetes, who may have cancer? What we don't think about is how can I see this whole person and the complexity of their lives, and think about what's general in that and how I can support that. And the third thing is that we don't invest in network capability. So we see that most barriers to health change are social, they're not clinical. But so what we started to do was, as you see in here, we started to kind of map what kind of networks people already had. This was in the research phase of our work, and how we could use those. Because we know that social networks are the greatest influence on whether we become unwell, and then how we can manage that wellness or unwellness. And so we wanted to kind of root ourselves in that. So based on these findings, we hired a small team of what we call relational workers. And so in the health work I do, and in fact many different of the projects I have, we have these relational workers who come from a really wide range of backgrounds. Some have a health background, but some come to us from the theatre, from social work, from business, from design. And the training we offer our relational workers is practical. Everything is learned through actually participating in the projects. And so we did nothing in our work that was condition specific. So everybody who came to us, we don't mind if you're depressed or you're diabetic, if you have a heart condition, if you have trouble breathing. What we start with is you and your life. What would be the first thing that you could do that would make a difference? So here we have Anne and Amy, who's one of our relational workers on the left. And the first stage is just open listening. We're just sitting there. We have the time, which clinicians don't have. And this open listening is very empowering. Later on, the doctors are very surprised by the results we get with the patients that they know, usually patients that they've given up on, because these patients stick with us and keep coming back over time because of this radical listening. So, first of all, Anne begins to make new connections. She begins to think about herself in new ways, and she begins to retell her story. And she begins, with the help of Amy, the relational worker, to break down what seems to her to be insurmountable troubles into very small, tiny steps. And so Amy says, you know, what's the first thing you could do that would make a change to your life? And Anne says, well, that she'd like to embroider, that she likes sewing. She used to sew, and these days she doesn't even sew. So Amy says, great, let's do that. Let's start with that. And Anne's mood lifts. She feels better about herself because she's taken up a hobby again. And then she comes back. And then it's the first stage of kind of building this work. Because, sorry, this is just kind of thinking about what the steps. We have a kind of very simple, practical, very visual tools to help this process of breaking down the steps. And then what we do is we kind of keep going back round and round again. So we kind of think about what would what could make a change, how we can integrate that change in the life, how we can sustain it, and then what's the next step? The next step with Anne actually was, okay, what are you cooking? Anne is cooking meals that she shouldn't be eating. She knows she shouldn't be eating them, but she feels to have to cook them for her husband and her son. So how can we unpick this complicated process about what Anne is cooking and eating? And then gradually what we do is we kind of begin to look at the social connections around each person. Sometimes this is saying, who do you already know that you can do something with? And sometimes it's saying, okay, look, there's a group that walk their dogs. We call them the Welly Mob. Why don't you join them and kind of join this group and begin to walk with this group? And something that's really striking about the work I'll come to is we measure our work across a whole different range of things, but one of them is about relationships. And in the health work, when we start, almost always participants say to us, oh, this isn't important. I don't need relationships in my life. This isn't important. And that's for a whole range of reasons. Sometimes it's that people are lonely and they don't want to admit it. Sometimes they really can't see that relationships would make a difference. So we have to work very gradually to kind of include people in the networks. But it's the relationships that sustain the changes that we're making in people's lives. So this is a kind of map, really, of how it looks with going round again. And the methods might not sound very orthodox. You know, when the doctors first hear that we're doing sewing, they're a bit surprised. But whatever it is that makes that person feel confident in themselves, that's where we start. And the clinical data begins to impress the doctors. 75% of our members sustain weight loss. 44% reduce their blood pressure. 75% give up smoking for good, and so on. And just as importantly for us, 72% actively re-engage with the community around them, and 64% go back to work. So what's different? What's different is three things. First of all, as I've said, it's not condition-specific. The approach starts in Anne's life and with those parts of her that are not ill but are well. Secondly, the relational worker is not there to refer to another service. So Amy doesn't say, oh, what's your problem? Now I understand it. I think this service could be good for you, or this professional will help you. What she does is she says, what can you do? Let's start from your imagined future. Let's work really gradually backwards, and I'll stay here alongside you to support that change, which is very different. And thirdly, we understand that sticking to change is much harder than making the change in the first place, and that's why we kind of really concentrate on who are the right people around us. So this approach, based on very small steps, practicing new ways of being, having someone beside you, rooted in capability, has powerful effects. And in my book, Radical Help, I also show how this approach saves money, which is very important in the UK context. Now, I'm sure that many of you here today do very, very similar work to the work I've described. But the problem is that because most of the system's energy and resources are still dedicated to these very vertical clinical models, these very mass production models. Although there's a lot of brilliant work, like I'm describing, it's still on the margins. It doesn't represent the system for most people, and it doesn't represent most people's experience of the system. So when I come to Scandinavia, this year I've been working in Denmark and in Norway, I'm always amazed at all the resource you have, your incredible professionals, your buildings, your mindsets, your commitment. But I do also see some parallels to the work I do in the UK. Because what I see is, despite the brilliance, many people are trapped within these systems. They're very well taken care of by the health systems and the welfare systems generally, but their lives aren't actually changing. And so this, I think, is the problem, that our brilliant systems, which in their day transform lives, were designed for a very different era and for a different economy and a different set of problems. And I think all across the world, these systems are actually beyond reform, and that we can't tinker with the existing models, whether it's a health model or an employment model or a family model. We need to think again. And in the book that I've written, which I have here, Radical Help, it's about to be translated into Danish, I offer 3 reasons why I think that we need to think again, which I'm just going to go through very, very quickly. So the first is that we face new problems like loneliness, mass migration, chronic health conditions, the challenges of environment, living on a fragile planet. I think what's really important about these problems is not just that many of them were not thought of when we first designed our welfare systems. It's that actually these problems are really different in nature. We can't solve challenges like chronic conditions or climate change without mass participation. And yet, as I've said, all our systems are designed very much to control us and also to keep us at arm's length. You know, the doctor will see you now and the person is there and you have your appointment. It's not about any kind of real communication and relationship. I think there's a second major challenge, which is that the economic structures on which all these models were based doesn't exist anymore. So the welfare state, when it was invented, was about a stable job for life. You might be out of work for temporary periods. But they were industrial systems designed to support an industrial way of life. And that way of life has gone, bringing with it different patterns of work, different patterns of family, different patterns of health, and so on. And then the other thing is that everywhere we look, our welfare states were based really on unpaid women's work. The housewife would take care of the children, the parents, the husband, the neighbours, and so on. Now, in the 1970s in Denmark, you address these challenges, and you have these excellent universal models of childcare that, of course, we really envy in Britain. But now there's a new challenge, which is who should take care of our parents, our beloved older generation? And we don't know, and all of our systems are having a trouble with that. But the third, perhaps the most profound reason I think that we need to change the systems is poverty, because poverty hasn't gone away. William Beveridge, who designed the British welfare system, was convinced that he would sort poverty out, there would be no poverty, and he would be really shocked by what he would see today. And here in Denmark, of course, you don't have the extreme poverty we have in Britain, but poverty has doubled in Denmark, and child poverty is growing too. And the digital economy is widening the gaps between us, between those who earn kind of the dizzying sums that algorithms of high finance bring and those who do the kind of really important work of care. And this is very divisive, because what happens then when our incomes separate is that conversations begin to separate too, and people begin to say, well, why are we investing in our welfare system? And isn't it just those people's fault? If only they did more exercise, or if only they had more motivation, surely things would change. And so we begin to get these conversations which we have in Britain about whose fault it is and who really deserves services. And these gaps in income not only become gaps in the kind of conversations we have, they become gaps in geography, because increasingly we live further and further away from each other, and we don't know each other anymore. So we don't really know, perhaps, anybody who lives in that neighbourhood where all those who've recently come to our country live. We don't go to school together, we don't join the same clubs, and so the conversations widen yet again. And this matters because it's increasingly, social research shows, it's our relationships and those who we get to know that predict our life chances. Whether we get a good job, whether we're well taken care of, what our health's like, who takes care of us in the end, all of this is about relationships. So modern poverty is about money, and it's also about relationships. And our traditional welfare systems are in a crisis because they can't see both sides of this equation. And so they can sometimes take care of us, but they can't be like a trampoline that kind of gives us the base to bounce off and really develop, create energy, and propel ourselves. So the question is, what can we do, as I said at the beginning? And with the health work I've described, that's one response to this crisis. It turns upside down our usual way of thinking. But I wanted to just briefly, how am I doing for time? I'm doing okay. I wanted to just briefly look at another example of aging, because aging overlaps very closely with the challenges of chronic conditions. So I'm sure that most of you know what is a bigger killer than a lifetime of smoking. Do you know what is a bigger killer than smoking? Loneliness. Hey, it's good, yes, because I want you to ask me questions later so we can kind of warm up a bit. Loneliness. So according to government data in the UK, 1 in 3 people over the age of 60 talks to another person once a week. 1 in 10 people, that's nearly 1 million people, only talks to another person once a month. And this problem is growing across the Western world, also in China, many places. And as I say, the services that we have aren't fit to address this type of challenge, because loneliness is like a collective relational issue. It's not a service that can be given to you like a package and you can be sent somebody to be your friend. You don't want that. You want a friend who's somebody that you really like. So in the same way with the process I showed you, I started to work alongside older people in South London, going for Sunday lunch, playing bingo, observing, listening, trying to think how we could address this issue of loneliness in particular, but more generally, how we could support older people to live a rich and flourishing life. And basically, people told me they wanted 2 things. They wanted practical support. They don't want to join a list. They want immediate, on-demand support. If a light bulb needs changing, why can't somebody come and help me rather than wait until I fall over the ladder in the dark and end up in hospital? And the second thing is, people want good company. We have these things in Britain we call befriending services, where a charity sends you somebody to have a cup of coffee with you or to do something. And people are like, we don't want this. We don't want to feel like a charity case. What we want are the opportunities to make new friends like we make at every stage in our life. So we invited some of the people who'd helped us to come and join us in our small studio around the table. And this is the kind of prototyping phase. So what we do is we build very small mock-ups of the service we're going to design. It's not a pilot, because you're building kind of something to learn. And again, it's all about the importance of using new and different ways to work if we want to design new and different things. And so people told us they wanted company and they wanted practical support. So we rented a phone line, we hired a couple of handymen, and we started a service that's now called Circle. And Circle provides an 0800 toll-free number. I'm just going to tell you very quickly how it works, for practical support. So you become a member for a very low sum, and you can call us day or night for any support you need. And people call us when they're coming out of hospital and they want support. They call us if their pets are unwell. They call us if they're going home in the dark and they just want somebody to check that they're there after dark. And so we organise all of this, and also a rich social calendar of art tours, darts, knitting circles, hot air ballooning, you name it. And so it's a curated social network. So everybody can join, but also we make sure that we really reach out to those people who might not join otherwise. And these are 2 of our members, Florence on the left and Olive on the right. And I just want to talk about Olive because you see Olive in the pocket part, the little part near where I live. But when we met Olive, she told us she was housebound, that she couldn't leave her house. And so one of the interesting things is, how does this happen? How does Olive go from being somebody who can't leave her house to somebody who's pushing somebody else around in the park? And it isn't, of course, that we are like doing a biblical miracle. It also isn't that she didn't tell the truth. It's that what happens is that because there isn't enough support, when the social worker visits, she realizes that she can either leave Olive to get a little weaker, or she can put a label on her and say, you know, you're a housebound person, and then Olive will get the support she needs. And then the support comes, and to begin with, Olive thinks, well, this feels a bit weird because I'm not a housebound person. But slowly, she kind of gets used to it. She's also scared if she goes out of the house, what will happen is somebody will see her and she'll lose the support that she really needs. So gradually, she becomes to think of herself as housebound until she really is housebound. And this is what happens in our services. But when there's something to do that she actually really wants to do, that she's intrigued, and I really do want to get out and join that, and when there's somebody there to stand at her side in the first few times so she doesn't feel vulnerable or kind of nervous about it, she begins to reintegrate in society, and that's what happens. And that's the most interesting thing, really, that over time it's these relationships between people that take over. So this is Belinda in the middle, who was going into hospital to have a knee operation. And so the person who ran her local circle, we started them in different parts of Britain, knew that she would be out of action. And he called her and he said, you know, what help do you need when you come out of hospital? And she's like, I'm fine, because, you know, Belinda's going to do the shopping, Joe's going to do the garden, Melissa's going to come in and chat, and so on. And so basically 5 people that she had met through the circle had organised to take care of her. And Belinda's in her 80s, and she said, you know, I feel 25 inside. But she also said that when she joined, she did feel very lonely, But gradually, through inviting her to a circle event and involving her more and more, she made the relationships that began to replace the formal services. And so this is the thing, really, that it's the relationships and the connections that we're making that over time make the difference. There are 10,000 members of Circle, and this is a slide that shows the kind of growth and capability. It's a mock-up, really, but we measure traditional outcomes, but we also measure, are we fostering relationships, are we supporting people to carry on working and learning and carry on growing a sense of themselves in later life, and participation in the environment and the community. But we also kind of measure more traditional outcomes, such as the fact that more people are, one of the key things here, I think, is this one on the side, that 13% of people are visiting the doctor less. So what we see over time is that there's less demand for services that weren't necessary because people are using their relationships to talk to each other and keep good company. And so the results are important, but what I really want to underline is that people's lives are changing. So both these new approaches to health and to good old age and other work I've done with families, young people and those out of work, road test a new framework. And these are the 6 principles that I write about in my book and that really, I believe, are the core to changing our systems. And I can't go through all of them with you, but I just want to kind of touch on the first 2. So I think the first thing is that we need to kind of think again about what is the vision. What are we all working towards? Because when our welfare systems were invented, there was a vision about what would be a good life for everybody and how would people join in and participate. And over time, we've lost that really big vision, and we've begun to talk about services and quite small things. How can I improve the service? How can I kind of get this person's health indicators up by this level? I think we can only make change when we go back and we remake a really big vision. And I suggest a vision about flourishing, that we ask ourselves, in this century, which is so different, what are the things we really need to flourish? And then, because this can't be an empty promise, we can't just say we're going to believe in flourishing, is the second point, which is how can we actually make this happen? And I suggest that we have this inversion. I think that basically all our services are about meeting people's needs and supporting their needs. And what I want to do, and I do in the practical work, is I turn this upside down and I say, what are the capabilities that we need to flourish in this century? And then what are the approaches we could design that would make sure that everybody has those capabilities? And so these are the 4 capabilities that underpin the work that I suggest we need. That we need the possibility of working and learning, by which I don't mean just getting exam results and kind of getting a sort of, some kind of job. I mean the idea of constantly being able to expand and to grow. We need good health and vitality. We need participation in a local community, and we need a good network of relationships. So this capability approach starts by asking a really simple question of everybody, which is, what can I really be or do? And the approach, some of you might know, originates with the Nobel-winning economist Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen grew up in famine zones. He grew up in the biggest famine in Bengal in India. And one of the things he wanted to know was, why do people starve when they're so close to food? That in all famines, people are actually very close to food, but they go hungry. And we could use this as a metaphor for a lack of participation in our societies. And what his work shows is that it's all sorts of very complicated structural things that mean that people starve when they're close to food, that they're lonely when there is good company close to them, when perhaps they don't have good health, although the possibility of good health is close to them, and so on. Because all these things are mediated by how we see ourselves, what we think we deserve, and by real concrete things around us, where we live, what our neighbourhood's like, what kind of work we have, and so on. So I don't think it's good enough just to say, oh, there are opportunities, oh, there's a service. Because with all the people I'm talking about, Olive and Anne, they live in a big city, they live in vibrant places, but they're not really able to connect to people around them. So I think what we can be and do depends on our inner worlds, our beliefs, our self-confidence, what we're taught to expect. And the work I do, we work on those inner worlds of how people see themselves and feel about themselves. But that's not enough. We can't just say to people, oh, be happy. There's a lot of kind of work in Britain at the moment telling people to be happy. We have to also concentrate on these structural issues around poverty, around social conditions, around neighbourhoods. And so this framing, this keeping in mind of internal world and external structural reality is one of the reasons that I focus on this capability approach. And I think the other thing that's really important in this approach is that it argues that so much social policy is really framed by elites, and it's one of the reasons that it doesn't work when it hits our communities. And so the capability approach doesn't tell you what's important from the perspective of the service, that this service is trying to improve this thing and we're counting and measuring this thing. Instead, it does start with this question about you. What can you, the individual, really be and do, and how can I support you? But I think the most interesting thing that I've learned over time through the measurement in the work is that it's this relationship capability that is the most strong. So it's relationships that enable the participants in our health projects to sustain change over time. It's relationships that enable older people to flourish. And we have this game called Jenga. Do you know this game called Jenga with the wooden blocks? Does everybody know this game? Do you have this game, Jenga? Yeah. And so in my mind, I liken relationships to this game called Jenga, which I think in a life you can take out some blocks and people can still stand up. But if you take out this fundamental block about relationships, then our lives really do fall apart. So I say that in policy and in our everyday interactions, we have to ask ourselves, does everything I do, does this housing, does this health intervention, is this fostering, is this strengthening already existing social bonds, or is it beginning to unpick them? Is it asking us to rely on the professional, not on each other, and so on? So this implies a very different practice, because if we're going to build relationships, what matters is what happens in that interaction between each of us, between the professional and the patient, between the community worker and the community. It's all about that, what happens, what that kind of conversation and listening is like with the person seeking help. And the philosopher and the psychoanalyst Jonathan Lear talks about help like this. He says, to be truly kind, one must be able to distinguish between a situation in which one needs to step forward to help someone who's struggling from a superficially similar situation in which you have to step back and allow that struggling person to develop their own skills and their own sense of autonomy. A kind person is sensitive to that difference, and they notice what will happen, and therefore they know how to act in an appropriate way. In this approach, I think this is the important thing, because this is what's so challenging to our current systems. In this approach, there is no way to specify in a particular set of circumstances what is the kind thing to do, independently of the judgment of the kind person. So what this is saying is that only the professional in that situation, in that conversation, really knows what they should do. You can't prescribe the program, you can't prescribe the measures. You have to really open up for a genuine relationship. And this is so far from the way, in Britain at least, we see our services, where everything is mandated, everything is codified. You know, you do this, you get referred from here to there. All of this has to go in what I describe as radical help. And yet, even though this seems so far from what we have, I've seen again and again, in almost impossible circumstances, how if we stand beside somebody and allow the struggling person to define their own path with this open and kind support, then change does happen that's meaningful and lasting. So the question is then, how can we transition? And in the book Radical Help, I devote the last third of the book to discussing how we can move from the systems we have now to the systems we need to get to. And I don't have all the answers, of course, but I do have some important starting points. And I think the first thing is that we have to start with what is abundant, because it's not just that our problems are different in this century, the resource we have in this century is different too. And I just want to kind of say a word about technology, because in every case, all the work I do is made possible by digital technology. So I don't use technology to prop up the existing systems, to make it more efficient, to make booking the doctor's appointment easier, or to kind of find your records online. All these things are good, but I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in taking the existing service and putting it online. I'm interested in how we can use digital technology to turn upside down the existing business models and to make sure that we can really connect people together in meaningful ways. Because when I describe something like Circle, the older people's service that I have here, in the 1970s, we all had these ideas, but it was too costly to organize, or it depended on one person in the community that had the energy to always keep everything going. But with kind of cheaply available platforms and systems, customer relationship management systems, what we can do is we can invent a service that can reach everybody, because it's entirely demand-driven. So in Circle, we don't have any buildings, we don't have any minibuses, we don't have any of the things that normally absorb costs in a service. What we have is a small team of dedicated people who have technology and in real time can connect people together. Oh, you want to kind of meet, here's some places you can meet. Oh, you want to go to hospital, here is somebody that can help you go to hospital, and so on. So we connect what's already there in the community in meaningful ways. And this is the other thing that we have in abundance, it's us. I think we want to participate, we want to join in, but the systems have to allow it. Just one kind of final thing I'll say is that when I go in Britain to different cities and talk about the work, the city leaders, they like it. They always say, oh, yeah, this would be great. I can really see how this would work, and I can really see it would cost less money, but here people will never participate. And there's always this kind of fear that we won't participate. And I think that's because our existing systems make participation very hard. But if we design new systems that from the very beginning are open and are about how we can join in, then I've seen again and again everybody wants to join in. And so this is the kind of, so much of my work is about turning things on their head. And this is the kind of most important inversion of all, I think, which is that the services I design and the solutions I design are stronger the more people that join in. So instead of putting any money into assessing people and saying, do you deserve this system? Can I refer you here or there? What I say is, let's keep it open. With Circle, the more members, the stronger the circle is, because the more lifts we have, the more company we have, the more ideas we have. So basically, we let everybody in. The more in, the stronger we are. So this, I think, is the most important thing in the work I'm describing, is this network of relationships. But the other thing I think is that although the book I write is called Radical Help, I don't think the work is actually radical. I think it's all around us. But I think the challenge is the frameworks around it, because this work doesn't look like the work that most funders want to support. It looks messy. It doesn't fit the existing categories. It certainly doesn't fit the existing measurement frameworks. It's very often about instincts, not rules. But the fact is we could make change very, very fast if we invested in what already exists, in growing these models, which are out there at the moment, existing in spite of the system. So this is what I want to kind of leave you with, is the idea of relationships underpinned by technology, that this way of working is the secret to good health. And I think this way of working takes care of everyone, those who need support, but also professionals who can then work in environments that support them to do the good work that we're all trained to do. So thank you. I hope that you will ask me some questions now. So thank you very much.
Just reminded me of a remark a social worker had to a very difficult family she worked with. And she said this family only has friends that were paid for it. And they actually had 18 professional helpers, but no relationships.
Yes.
So in fact, I think you come up with a better solution than the normal social services were able to. So it's just a comment.
I mean, we also do family work, and the families, I have in the book there's a chapter about them. They have 73 workers around them. It's the same story. And I think I didn't understand your presentation. Everybody was laughing, and I was desperate to know. But I think also you were talking about how there's a sort of mirroring of language we see as well in that. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I also have a question, if there are no other questions. Maybe a bit too specific, but anyway. If I... as a person in need of relations wants to engage with the circle, what would be the process? Can you walk me through how do I engage with the process? Do I call someone or do I meet with
So I think, first of all, if you're the person in need of relations, you're never going to engage with the circle. This is what's so important to the design, because if we feel lonely and we're not used to going out, I mean, I don't know, those of us who've done Ph.D.s in the room, for instance, like you're on your own and it feels terrifying to go out. So I think many of us, for different reasons, have this experience. So what you need somebody to visit you. So how this starts is often it can be neighbours or adult children that tell us that, oh, my mother or my father, would you mind visiting them? And so it's usually somebody else. And then the process starts by asking if we can visit, seeing if we can spend time having a cup of tea, not doing very much at first, just being there, perhaps noticing that there's something practical. Most people have got something practical they want, even if they won't admit that they want to kind of meet other people. So sorting out that practical thing, I don't know, rehanging the curtains or the light bulb or whatever it is, and then gradually building that relationship so that we can integrate the person into the circle, taking them usually to a coffee morning, sitting next to them at the coffee morning, making sure they're sitting next to somebody that we know is kind of kind and open, and then gradually the relationships take off. And it can take time, but once they're there, then we can step back. But we have to really, really facilitate the whole time, because otherwise communities will morph towards the strongest people in the group. Okay. No more questions.
Then I have another one. Do you see any perspectives in a work like the Circle or similar works for an organization like the Heart Foundation or health NGOs? How do you see that we as organization can use that model?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. In fact, I dedicate quite a bit of the book to this. And so the first thing is that in order to get this going, it needs investment and it needs some infrastructure. And I think organizations like yours have that investment and infrastructure to actually seed the model. So everywhere we go, it's a big organization, or it's a housing organization or local government that invest, first of all, to get it up and running in their area. Then the other thing is that for smaller organizations who are providing services, they really love it, because then if you live in a community, suddenly everything is visible. You didn't know that this thing is already happening in your community, and you can kind of see it on our platform. But we did definitely have some difficulties sometimes with all the smaller community organizations love our work and want to join in. But sometimes some of the bigger ones feel threatened, and they feel like, for instance, the very big aging organization in the UK was like, but we get government money to give a service to somebody. If this takes off, what's going to happen to our government money? So there definitely are tensions in this relationship. So it's a good question. Okay, thank you so much for having me.